My brother's lies tore our family apart, but the truth revealed a deeper betrayal. Hey Reddit, I'm Mike, 34, and I've spent most of my life living in the shadow of my older brother, Tom, 38. We've always had a strained relationship, full of competition, jealousy, and a lot of unspoken resentment. But recently, things reached a breaking point that tore our family apart. As secrets started coming to light, I discovered that the real betrayal was more complex than I ever could have imagined. Here's how a lifetime of family drama came crashing down, and the unexpected truths that changed everything. Growing up, my brother Tom was the golden child, the one who could do no wrong in the eyes of our parents. He was athletic, smart, and always had a charm that made people want to be around him. From the moment he joined the football team in middle school, he became the star of the family. Tom's talent on the field, combined with his easygoing nature, made him the center of attention at every family event. My parents, especially our dad, idolized him. From a young age, it was clear that Tom was destined for great things. He was the star quarterback of our high school football team, class president, and had a natural charisma that drew everyone in. Our dad, a former athlete who never quite made it big, lived vicariously through Tom's accomplishments. He'd proudly display Tom's trophies in our living room, each one polished and prominently placed. "That's my boy," Dad would say, beaming with pride, every time Tom's name appeared in the local paper. Mom would fuss over Tom before every game, packing him special snacks, and making sure his uniform was pristine. To them, Tom could do no wrong. I, on the other hand, was the quiet, more introverted one. I wasn't a star athlete, didn't get straight A's, and spent most of my time reading or playing video games. While Tom was out winning trophies, I was in my room sketching superheroes or tinkering with old computers, trying to lose myself in the things that brought me peace. I was the kid who was always in the background, overshadowed by Tom's achievements. I remember sitting in the stands at Tom's football games, watching my parents cheer for him like he was a celebrity. Dad would shout his name, beaming with pride, while I sat next to them, clapping quietly, feeling invisible. My relationship with Tom was complicated. On the surface, we were like any other brothers, fighting over the TV remote, playing pranks on each other, and occasionally teaming up to get out of trouble. But underneath, there was always a sense of competition, a need to prove myself, and a growing resentment that I couldn't quite put into words. Tom thrived in the spotlight, while I was always in his shadow, never quite measuring up to the golden standard he set. It didn't help that Tom loved to remind me of his success. He'd brag about his latest accomplishments, subtly putting me down in the process. "Hey, Mike, you should really try out for something at school," he'd say, a smirk on his face. "Maybe it'll get you out of the house more." It was never overtly cruel, but the message was clear: I wasn't enough. Our parents, especially Dad, played into it without realizing the damage they were doing. They'd constantly compare us, holding Tom up as the example of what I should strive to be. "Why can't you be more like your brother?" Dad would say whenever I'd get a B on a test or skip out on a sports tryout. "Tom never gives up. He always goes after what he wants." Mom would try to soften the blow, patting me on the back and saying things like, "Your talents are just different, Mike." But it always felt like a consolation prize, a way to placate me without addressing the deeper issues at play. The subtle favoritism in our house wasn't malicious, it was just the way things were. But those words cut deep, and over time, I started to internalize them. I felt like I was always coming up short, no matter how hard I tried. I buried myself in books and video games, finding solace in the fictional worlds that felt more welcoming than my own family. I spent hours alone, drawing, reading comic books, and getting lost in movies. In those worlds, I could be anyone, a hero, a genius, someone who mattered. But in reality, I was just Mike, the little brother who could never quite keep up. Tom continued to excel, winning awards, getting into a top-tier college on a football scholarship, and landing a job at a prestigious law firm straight out of school. Meanwhile, I stumbled my way through college, struggling to find my path. Despite the tension, I still loved my brother. I looked up to him in a way, admiring his confidence and the ease with which he navigated life. But as we grew older, the differences between us only became more pronounced. Tom moved to the city, got a high-paying job, and married his college sweetheart, Jessica, a beautiful and ambitious woman who matched his drive. They had a picture-perfect life, complete with a nice house, fancy cars, and yearly vacations to exotic destinations. I stayed closer to home, working as a graphic designer at a small marketing firm. I lived in a modest apartment, single and still trying to figure out what I wanted out of life. I found joy in my work, designing websites and logos for small businesses, but it never felt like enough in the eyes of my parents. Our parents continued to fawn over Tom, attending every one of his milestones with pride, while my achievements felt like footnotes in comparison. I'd bring home a promotion or finish a big project, and the response was always lukewarm, "That's nice, Mike. But have you seen what Tom's been up to?" Family gatherings became painful reminders of my second-place status. I grew to resent those occasions, where Tom would regale everyone with stories of his latest business deal or vacation, while I'd sit quietly, struggling to contribute to the conversation. It was like being a guest in my own family, always on the outside looking in. Tom seemed to have it all, and I was just trying to keep up, always a step behind. The real turning point in our relationship came when our dad decided to retire and hand over the family business, a small but successful auto repair shop that he'd built from the ground up. Dad had worked tirelessly to grow the shop, pouring his heart and soul into it, and it was his pride and joy. I had vivid memories of spending weekends at the shop, sweeping floors, organizing tools, and listening to Dad's stories about the early days when he could barely afford the rent. From a young age, Dad taught me everything he knew about cars, how to change oil, fix a flat, and even rebuild engines. The shop wasn't just a business to me, it was home. I'd always felt a strong connection to it, and I knew every inch of the place like the back of my hand. It was a modest garage with grease-stained floors, a wall lined with old license plates, and the smell of motor oil that seemed to cling to everything. But it was ours, and I loved it. Dad always talked about passing it down to one of us, keeping it in the family, and ensuring that his legacy lived on. I'd always assumed that would be me. Tom had never shown much interest in the shop, preferring the boardrooms of high-rise offices to the grime and grit of auto repair. He'd pop in once in a while to say hello or drop off his car for a free tune-up, but that was the extent of his involvement. I'd imagined that one day, I'd take over the shop, modernize it, and maybe even expand. I had plans updating the equipment, adding a digital booking system, and turning the shop into a community staple. I wanted to honor what Dad had built while making it my own. But when Dad announced his retirement, he made it clear that he wanted Tom to take over. "Tom's got the business sense," he said, patting my brother on the back. "He'll take this place to the next level." I was stunned. Tom had never shown any interest in the shop, barely setting foot in the place since high school. He didn't know the first thing about running it, and he certainly didn't have the passion that I did. I tried to protest, to explain that I'd been there all along, but Dad brushed me off. "Mike, you're better off doing your own thing," he said, his tone dismissive. "Tom's the one with the experience to keep this place thriving." Tom accepted the offer without hesitation, eager to add another achievement to his list. He swooped in, making big changes almost immediately. He introduced new management techniques, streamlined operations, and implemented flashy marketing strategies that were completely out of touch with the shop's loyal customer base. He treated it like just another business deal, cold and impersonal, and it wasn't long before the shop's atmosphere changed. The regulars, old-timers who had been coming to the shop for years, didn't take kindly to the new approach. They'd grumble about the new prices, the impersonal service, and the loss of the down-to-earth vibe that had kept them coming back. Tom didn't seem to care. To him, the shop was just another asset to be optimized for maximum profit. He replaced the familiar, worn-out waiting room with sleek, modern furniture, added a high-tech coffee machine that no one knew how to use, and even changed the shop's logo to something more professional. I tried to offer my input, to suggest ways we could improve without losing the essence of what Dad had built, but Tom shut me down at every turn. "I've got this under control, Mike," he'd say, barely glancing up from his laptop. "I don't need you second-guessing me." It was like every interaction we'd had as kids, but now with higher stakes. Tom was the star, and I was the nuisance, the annoying little brother who was always in the way. The final blow came when Tom decided to sell the shop's original location, a small, worn-down building that held decades of memories. It was the heart of the business, the place where Dad had started with nothing but a few tools and a dream. Tom called it a strategic move, claiming that a newer, more modern space would attract a better clientele. But to me, it felt like a betrayal of everything Dad had worked for. When I confronted Tom about it, things got heated. "You can't just erase everything Dad built," I said, my voice shaking with anger. "This place means something. It's not just a business, it's our family." Tom rolled his eyes, dismissive as always. "You're too sentimental, Mike. This is about growth, about making smart decisions. If you can't see that, then maybe it's better if you stay out of it." That was the moment I realized that Tom and I were fundamentally different. He saw the shop as just another asset, something to be bought, sold, and manipulated for profit. I saw it as a legacy, a part of our family's history that deserved to be honored and preserved. But Tom's voice was the only one that mattered, and once again, I was left feeling powerless. The sale went through, and the shop relocated to a sleek new space on the outskirts of town. It was bigger, fancier, and completely devoid of the character that had made it special. The old regulars stopped coming, replaced by a new crowd that didn't know or care about the shop's history. Dad put on a brave face, insisting that it was a smart move, but I could tell that he was disappointed. The new shop was a far cry from the place he'd built with his own hands, and I knew it broke his heart to see it change. I stopped going to the shop after that. Every time I drove past the old location, now a soulless strip mall, I felt a pang of loss. It wasn't just about the building, it was about everything it represented. Tom had taken something that was supposed to be ours and turned it into something unrecognizable. The resentment I'd felt my whole life only deepened, festering into a wound that wouldn't heal. After the sale of the shop, Tom's involvement with the family business dwindled. He left most of the day-to-day operations to a newly hired manager and shifted his focus back to his corporate job, treating the shop as a side project rather than the passion Dad had envisioned. I tried to move on, burying myself in my work and distancing myself from Tom as much as possible. Our relationship, already strained, was now barely more than a cold politeness at family gatherings. Things took a turn when Dad fell ill unexpectedly. What started as fatigue and a persistent cough turned into something more serious, a diagnosis of lung cancer that hit us all like a freight train. Dad had always been strong, the backbone of our family, and seeing him weak and struggling was a harsh reminder of how fragile life could be. The doctor's visits, the chemo sessions, the endless waiting, it was all a nightmare we couldn't wake up from. Tom, true to form, stepped up in his own way, paying for the best doctors, arranging appointments, and managing Dad's medical bills. But as the weeks went by, it became clear that his involvement was more about control than genuine concern. He'd dictate who could visit, when Dad would see the doctors, and even made decisions about Dad's treatment without consulting anyone else. It was like he was running the show, and the rest of us were just along for the ride. I spent as much time as I could at Dad's side, sitting with him in the hospital, reminiscing about old times, and trying to keep his spirits up. I could tell he was worried about the shop, about what would happen if he wasn't around to keep an eye on things. He'd ask about it constantly, wanting updates on how business was going, and I'd do my best to reassure him, even though I wasn't sure myself. One afternoon, while Dad was resting, I decided to visit the new shop to see how things were really going. It was the first time I'd set foot in the place since Tom had relocated it, and I wasn't sure what to expect. I walked in, greeted by a receptionist who barely looked up from her phone, and immediately felt out of place. The walls were painted a sterile white, the waiting area filled with sleek, modern furniture that clashed with the shop's old-school charm. It was like walking into a corporate office rather than the humble garage I remembered. I asked to speak with the manager, hoping to get a sense of how the business was doing. He greeted me with a rehearsed smile, but I could tell he was uncomfortable. We sat down in his office, and I started asking questions about the day-to-day operations, the financials, and the overall state of the business. The more I probed, the more evasive his answers became. Finally, after some coaxing, he admitted that the shop was struggling. Business had dropped significantly since the move, with many of our loyal customers feeling alienated by the new location and higher prices. The flashy marketing strategies Tom had implemented weren't attracting the clientele he'd hoped for, and the shop was hemorrhaging money. To make matters worse, Tom had been using funds from Dad's personal savings to cover the shortfall without telling anyone. I was furious. Tom had assured Dad that the shop was thriving, that the changes he'd made were paying off, but it was all a lie. He was running the business into the ground, and instead of taking responsibility, he was covering it up with Dad's hard-earned money. I felt sick thinking about all the times Dad had asked me how the shop was doing, and I'd blindly repeated Tom's lies. I confronted Tom that evening, determined to get some answers. We met at his house, a sprawling two-story in a gated community that felt worlds away from the reality of our family's struggles. Tom greeted me with his usual smug confidence, but I wasn't in the mood for pleasantries. "Why didn't you tell us the shop was failing?" I demanded, barely able to contain my anger. "You've been lying to Dad, taking his money, and pretending like everything's fine." Tom's expression hardened, his easygoing facade cracking. "I did what I had to do," he said defensively. "The shop needed the cash flow, and I didn't want Dad to worry. He's sick, Mike. The last thing he needs is more stress." "More stress?" I scoffed, my voice rising. "You've been running this place into the ground, and instead of fixing it, you're making it worse. Dad trusted you, and you've been lying to his face." Tom sighed, rubbing his temples like he was dealing with a minor inconvenience rather than the mess he'd created. "You don't get it, Mike. You never have. Running a business isn't as simple as you think. Sometimes you have to make tough decisions. Like stealing from your own father?" I shot back. "You've always done whatever you wanted, no matter who it hurts. This isn't about tough decisions, it's about your ego." The argument escalated, both of us shouting over each other, years of buried resentment finally boiling over. Tom accused me of being jealous, of always trying to tear him down because I couldn't stand to see him succeed. I fired back, telling him he'd never cared about the family, that everything he did was for show, and that he was nothing but a fraud. In the end, nothing was resolved. Tom refused to take responsibility, insisting that he was doing what was best for the business and the family. I left his house feeling angrier than ever, my faith in my brother completely shattered. For the first time, I truly saw him for what he was, a man who would lie, cheat, and manipulate anyone to get what he wanted, even his own family. The confrontation with Tom marked a turning point in our already strained relationship. I couldn't stand to be around him, and the tension between us was palpable at every family gathering. Our parents, especially Mom, tried to keep the peace, but it was impossible to ignore the rift that had formed. I stopped pretending that everything was fine, and Tom, true to form, continued to act as if he was the victim in all of this. Dad's condition worsened, and the strain of watching him battle cancer took a toll on all of us. I spent as much time as I could with him, trying to make up for all the moments we'd lost to petty arguments and unspoken resentment. We'd sit together in the hospital room, reminiscing about the good old days when the shop was just a small garage with a couple of beat-up cars and a dream. I could see in his eyes the sadness, the regret for things left unsaid, and the worry about what would happen to the family and the shop he'd worked so hard to build. Dad would ask about the shop, his voice weak but filled with hope. "How's business, Mike? Tom keeping everything running smoothly?" I'd force a smile, nodding along even though the truth was eating me up inside. I didn't have the heart to tell him what was really happening, that Tom's mismanagement was driving the business into the ground. I didn't want to be the one to break his heart, not when he was already fighting so hard. Tom, for his part, kept up appearances, visiting Dad regularly and putting on a show of being the dutiful son. He'd bring expensive gifts, talk about his latest work deals, and reassure Dad that the shop was in good hands. It was all a lie, but Dad never suspected a thing. He trusted Tom, even when he didn't deserve it. As Dad's health continued to decline, the tension between Tom and me reached a boiling point. We were barely speaking, and when we did, it was always laced with hostility. I was tired of the lies, the manipulation, and the constant need to one-up each other. It was like we were stuck in an endless cycle of resentment, each trying to prove that we were the better brother. The breaking point came one night after a particularly heated argument. We were at Mom's house, trying to plan Dad's birthday celebration, a small gathering given his condition. Tom and I couldn't agree on anything, each suggestion turning into another battle of wills. Mom tried to mediate, but it was no use. Tom accused me of being selfish, of always making things about me, and I finally snapped. "You've been lying to everyone, Tom," I shouted, my voice shaking with anger. "You've been stealing from Dad, letting the shop fail, and pretending like you're some kind of hero. I'm done with your crap. Tom's face turned red, his hands clenching into fists. You don't know what you're talking about, he hissed. You've never understood the pressure I'm under. You sit there in your little bubble, judging me, but you've never had to carry this family on your shoulders. Carry this family? I laughed bitterly. You've done nothing but take. You've taken the shop, you've taken Dad's money, and you've taken every opportunity to make yourself look good at my expense. You're not the hero, Tom. You're the problem. The argument escalated, both of us shouting over each other, years of buried resentment finally boiling over. Mom tried to intervene, but we were too far gone. I stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind me, and vowed that I was done with Tom. I couldn't keep pretending that we were a family when the lies were tearing us apart. A few weeks after the argument, I received a call from Dad's lawyer. It was unexpected, and my stomach twisted with a sense of dread. I knew Dad's condition was getting worse, but I hadn't expected to hear from his lawyer. I drove to the office, my mind racing with possibilities, and sat down across from a man I'd only met once before at a family function. The lawyer, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a somber expression, greeted me with a tight smile. He explained that Dad had updated his will recently and wanted me to be aware of some changes. My heart sank, fearing the worst. I braced myself for the possibility that Tom had somehow manipulated Dad into leaving him everything, the shop, the house, and whatever little savings were left. But what the lawyer told me was something I never could have anticipated. Dad had discovered what Tom was doing, the lies, the mismanagement, and the financial deceit. He'd found out that Tom was using his savings to prop up the failing business and had been devastated by the betrayal. According to the lawyer, Dad had confronted Tom about it, and in a rare moment of honesty, Tom had confessed everything. Dad had decided to cut Tom out of the will, leaving the shop and the family home to me instead. He'd set up a trust fund for Mom to ensure she was taken care of, but Tom would receive nothing. It was Dad's final act of defiance, a way to protect what little was left of his legacy from being further tainted by Tom's greed. I sat there, stunned, as the lawyer handed me a sealed letter that Dad had written. It was addressed to me, and I opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a heartfelt apology, not just for what Tom had done, but for all the years Dad had failed to see the truth. He wrote about his regrets, about how he'd put Tom on a pedestal without considering the impact it had on me. He admitted that he'd been wrong, that he'd let Tom's charm and ambition blind him to the flaws that had always been there. I'm sorry, Mike, the letter read. I wish I could go back and do things differently. You've always been the steady one, the one who truly cared about this family. I see that now, and I'm proud of you in ways I never expressed. I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me. Tears streamed down my face as I read the letter, my heart aching with a mix of grief and relief. For so long, I'd felt like the forgotten son, the one who would never measure up to Tom. But in the end, Dad had seen the truth. He'd seen me. It was a bittersweet vindication, knowing that Dad had finally recognized my worth, but it came too late to heal the wounds that had been festering for years. Armed with the truth, I knew I had to confront Tom one last time. I needed answers, and I needed him to understand the damage he'd done. I drove to his house, my mind swirling with everything I wanted to say. Tom greeted me at the door, surprised to see me, but I wasn't in the mood for small talk. We need to talk, I said, pushing past him and stepping into his pristine living room. I could feel the tension in the air, the unspoken animosity that had been building between us for years. Tom looked wary, but he followed me, closing the door behind him. What's this about, Mike? I tossed the letter onto the coffee table, watching as his eyes darted to the familiar handwriting. Dad found out, I said bluntly. He knew what you were doing, the lies, the money, everything. Tom's face paled, and for the first time, I saw genuine fear in his eyes. Mike, No, I cut him off, my voice firm. You don't get to explain this away. You've spent your whole life taking advantage of everyone around you, and Dad finally saw you for what you are. He cut you out, Tom. He left everything to me. Tom sank into the nearest chair, his shoulders slumping under the weight of the revelation. He stared at the letter, his expression a mix of shock and despair. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. But then I remembered all the times he'd lied, manipulated, and twisted the truth to suit his own agenda. "I never wanted this," Tom said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was just trying to keep the shop going, to prove that I could handle it. I didn't mean for things to get so out of hand." "Prove it to who?" I demanded, my anger bubbling to the surface. "Dad?" "Me? Yourself? You've been living a lie, Tom, and you dragged everyone down with you. You took the one thing Dad cared about and turned it into a disaster." Tom looked up, tears in his eyes, but I couldn't tell if they were tears of regret or self-pity. "I've made mistakes," he admitted, his voice cracking. "I know that. But I didn't want to lose everything. I just wanted to be seen." His words hit me harder than I expected. For all his bravado, Tom had been chasing the same thing I'd been seeking my whole life: validation, approval, a sense of worth that we'd both been denied in different ways. But while I'd internalized my pain, Tom had lashed out, using his charm and ambition to cover up the insecurities that he'd never fully addressed. "I see you, Tom," I said finally, my anger giving way to a weary resignation. "But I can't fix this for you. You've got to figure it out on your own. And you need to make things right, not just for Dad, but for yourself." Tom nodded, but I could see that he was struggling to come to terms with the reality of his actions. It wasn't the resolution I'd hoped for, but it was a start. I left his house feeling drained, but also lighter, as if the burden of our lifelong rivalry had finally been lifted. In the weeks that followed, I focused on putting the pieces of my life back together. Dad's passing hit us all hard, and the grief was a constant companion, but I found solace in the shop. I took over the business, just as Dad had wanted, and set about restoring it to its former glory. It was hard work, but it was also healing, a way to honor Dad's legacy and create something I could be proud of. I brought back the old-school charm that had made the shop special, reconnecting with the loyal customers who had been driven away by Tom's impersonal changes. I hired a small, dedicated team, people who cared about the work as much as I did, and slowly but surely, the shop began to thrive again. It wasn't about profit or prestige, it was about doing something that mattered, something that felt real. I spent long hours at the shop, often working late into the night, tinkering with engines and making small improvements. I repainted the walls, restored the old license plate wall that Tom had torn down, and put up pictures of Dad throughout the years, from the early days of the shop to the last photo we'd taken together. Every corner of the shop felt like a tribute to Dad, and it gave me a sense of purpose that I hadn't felt in years. Tom, true to his word, stayed out of the shop's affairs. He found a new job, one that had nothing to do with the family business, and started the slow process of rebuilding his own life. We weren't close, and I wasn't sure we ever would be, but there was a tentative truce between us, a mutual understanding that we'd both made mistakes and that it was time to let go of the past. Mom, ever the peacemaker, tried to bring us together, hosting family dinners and encouraging us to reconnect. It was awkward at first, but over time, the tension began to ease. We still had our differences, but we were learning to coexist, if not as best friends, then at least as brothers who had been through the fire and come out the other side. One evening, as we sat around the dinner table, Tom raised a glass, his eyes meeting mine. "To Dad," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And to second chances." I nodded, clinking my glass against his. It wasn't a perfect resolution, and there were still scars that would never fully heal, but it was enough. We were moving forward, each in our own way, and that was all we could ask for. Life after Dad's passing was a mix of grief, healing, and unexpected moments of clarity. The shop became my sanctuary, a place where I could pour my energy and feel connected to something bigger than myself. Every oil change, every repaired engine, felt like a small act of honoring Dad's memory, and I took pride in knowing that I was carrying on the legacy he'd worked so hard to build. I also started to make amends with the parts of myself that I'd buried over the years, the quiet, introspective kid who never felt good enough, the young man who'd spent too long trying to measure up to his brother, and the adult who was finally learning to stand on his own. I stopped comparing myself to Tom, stopped letting his shadow define my worth, and embraced the life I was creating. I reconnected with old friends, started dating again, and found joy in the simple things: Sunday barbecues, game nights with the guys, and quiet evenings spent tinkering with my car in the garage. I wasn't chasing success or validation anymore, I was just living, and for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. Tom and I continued to navigate our complicated relationship, slowly finding a new rhythm that worked for us. We weren't the brothers we'd once been, and maybe we never would be, but there was a newfound respect between us, a recognition of the shared history that had shaped us, for better or worse. I started attending therapy, working through the years of resentment and the deep-seated insecurities that had fueled my rivalry with Tom. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. I learned to forgive myself, to let go of the guilt and anger that had been weighing me down, and to see Tom not as the enemy, but as someone who was just as lost as I'd been. We'd meet up occasionally for lunch, awkward at first but gradually becoming more comfortable. We talked about Dad, about the shop, and about our plans for the future. Tom was seeing a therapist too, trying to understand why he'd made the choices he did, and it was clear that he was genuinely trying to change. One day, as we sat in a small cafe, Tom looked at me and said something I never expected to hear. "I'm sorry, Mike," he said, his voice sincere. "For everything. I know I've messed up, and I've hurt you in ways I can't take back. But I'm trying to be better, and I hope you can forgive me." I stared at him, the weight of his words sinking in. It wasn't an easy thing to hear, and it didn't erase the past, but it was a start. "I forgive you, Tom," I said quietly. "And I'm sorry too. We've both made mistakes, but we're still here. That's got to count for something." We raised our coffee cups in a silent toast, not just to the second chances we'd been given, but to the brothers we were finally learning to become. It was a small step, but it was the beginning of something new, an imperfect, messy, but honest attempt to move forward. To anyone out there struggling with family drama, know that it's okay to feel hurt, to be angry, and to take time to heal. But also know that forgiveness, while not easy, is a powerful thing. It doesn't mean forgetting or excusing what's happened, but it does mean freeing yourself from the weight of the past. Thank you for listening, Reddit. This journey has been full of ups and downs, but it's also been a lesson in resilience, understanding, and the unexpected twists that life throws our way. Here's to new beginnings, to finding peace, and to embracing the complicated, beautiful mess of family.